on, level. No, he's going low. Here he comes up. He got the colonel's wingman, smoking on number 4. He's going out and down. Check the chute, you guys. One chute out of the tail. 2 out of the waist. The other 2 boys out of the nose. There's 2 more. Pilot the tail. Pilot the tail. Let me know how they're doing back there. Roger. Fighter, 6 o'clock. Coming through. 11 o'clock. Low. Yep, no chance there. Two 190s, high. Somebody got one of them on the button. That Jerry pilot bailed out. He's not walking away from it.
Barreling at you. A little short on heart, plenty long on guts, this enemy. Another 17 hit. And again, you have to close the gap in the formation. Again they come. 12 o'clock high, 4 o'clock level, out of the sun, and up from the ground.
Did a fighter or a flak get that ship? Flak, I think.
There it is, the flare out of the lead ship. The signal for the bomb run. This is your attack.
All right, Steve. We're on the IP. She's yours. I got her. Bombay doors open. Make a good run now, Steve. I'm on it.
Yes, make it count, bombardiers. They build these ships around you. Bombs away.
As Hap Arnold went about the vast problem of building American air power, of deciding what types of planes for what specific purposes, a concept began to form in his mind. Perhaps this concept went back to the day when he first saw the plane in which a Frenchman had flown across the Channel. That day when he thought, if one plane, why not many in the air at the same time? Now he saw the huge strength possible in mass formations of long-range bombers, each a fortress in the air, a multitude of flying fortresses in continued strategic bombing of the enemy. Meanwhile, destruction of the enemy air force in combat. Air supremacy. This was his goal. This was the biggest task of his life. With production chief Bill Knutson, Arnold toured plants and factories. As time went on, as people came to know who Hap was and the job he was doing, his reputation grew. Deadly serious, but always human, this was the way Hap Arnold did business. Air power. No one was better suited to talk about it than Hap, or better able to put words into action, to mold our Air Force into the strongest in the world. Hap's keen awareness of the significance of air power made him invaluable on the international scene. At many conferences, including Casablanca, Hap was able to work smoothly and effectively with our allies. But here, and for months to come, Hap was to argue for an idea that was not particularly acceptable: mass bombing of the enemy during daylight hours. The plan was not greeted with favor, for at this time the British were successfully carrying out a program of night bombing. While night bombing by the RAF was proving effective, it was General Arnold's argument that daylight precision bombing could cause far greater devastation than was possible during darkness. On the agenda at Casablanca were questions as to where the limited number of planes could be best utilized. General Arnold's plans received a green light from the other Allied participants. In the Atlantic, serious damage was being caused by German U-boats. To meet the menace, B-24s were assigned to the Anti-Submarine Command. The number of German submarines harassing our convoys began to decline. In the Far East, there were other problems. Arnold went over the air needs of this theater with General Joseph Stilwell and General Chennault. Here it was decided that a difficult flying route over the Himalayas could provide a flow of supplies to the Chinese. The airlift over the hump was one of the extraordinary accomplishments of the war. Hap Arnold, as Commanding General, U.S. Army Air Forces, was a member of the Allied staff which met to determine the future course of the war. Here at the Cairo Conference and at Quebec, Arnold became known for his judgment and common sense. Among leaders of other nations, Arnold was not only the good-natured man with the encyclopedic knowledge of planes and all matters concerning air power, he was a first-rate diplomat upon whom our military staff could depend. By this time, there was complete acceptance of Hap's daylight bombing program by the Allied command. Arnold had won a personal victory in a difficult realm. Pilots had been needed in large numbers early in the war, and with Arnold's encouragement, a women's branch of the Air Force was organized. The Women's Air Force Service Pilots, known as the WASPs, did a tremendous job during the war, freeing many Air Force pilots for combat duty. At the first graduation ceremony, Hap was the honored guest. By 1944, the program for massive high-altitude air bombardments began to reach its peak. Now, at last, thousands of strategic bombers with long-range fighter escorts were over Germany at the same time. And now the question was, could this tremendous all-out effort be continued? There was no let-up. There had been thorough planning in every detail that had placed the thousands of planes over Germany at the same time. No one was more instrumental in achieving our long-range plan for strategic bombing of the enemy than Hap Arnold. Through his effort, nothing had been allowed to stand in the way of the plan to use air power to knock Germany out of the war.
It's a war of attrition, and strategic bombing is an attritional form of warfare. Conventional strategic bombing, if you're talking nukes or you're talking annihilation, but just conventional bombs, you're grinding the enemy down. You've got this huge German war machine, and you just keep hitting on it and grinding on it. You may not be able to stop it, but you can slow it down. You can cause all sorts of friction and so forth and make it operate a lot less efficiently. And that all takes its toll. We bombed the aircraft industry, so the Germans dispersed the aircraft industry and made it bomb-proof, basically. But that made the planes produced extremely expensive because they lost all, the economy of effort, because they had small production lines. The train system was overwhelmed because it had to carry parts back and forth to all these little small production lines and carry the finished assemblies all around and this, that, and the other. So these planes, they produced a great many planes, but they were extremely expensive planes in terms of resources that caused entirely by strategic bombing. And by the time the planes were reduced, the bombers had killed all the oil plants, and so the planes couldn't fly and they couldn't train anyway. But so it's the kind of thing where you'd have to look at the totality of the effort and say that hitting oil hurt the Army because the Panzers couldn't move without fuel, the Luftwaffe couldn't fly or train without fuel, the U-boats couldn't go without fuel. Then they attacked the transportation system in the winter of 1944-45. German industry stopped. You need coal. Germany's like the Saudi Arabia of coal. And the German railroads themselves were starting to run out of coal, which means the people who were the means that was carrying the coals from the pit heads to the factories couldn't even supply itself. They embargoed sub-assemblies. All manufacturers' sub-assemblies were embargoed. Sounds sort of obscure, but when you think about it, how can any manufacturing process be done if you can't ship sub-assemblies from one manufacturer to the other? That basically that means that all coherent economic activity has stopped. But that's by February of 45, and by then the war's over anyway.
At the end, we were unmolested in the skies. Total air supremacy. At the close of the war in Germany, at the conference in Potsdam, Hap Arnold participated in plans for the unfinished work in the Pacific. Now able to concentrate full attention on the war with Japan, he flew to bases in the Pacific. Friendly and good-natured, he found what he wished to know without seeming to try. Receptive, even-tempered, he was on the best terms with his commanders, extremely sensitive to their problems. Now, according to plan, what had knocked out Germany could do the same in Japan. The B-29, the pioneer of air intercontinental bombing, the plane which, thanks to General Arnold's convictions and leadership, had been in the works long enough to be ready. 3 months after VJ Day, General of the Army Hap Arnold terminated 42 years of service. Hap lived to see his greatest dream come true. On September 18, 1947, the creation of a separate service, the United States Air Force. 5 years after retirement, his full life came to a close. He was buried at Arlington Cemetery in January 1950. Hosts of devoted friends mourned his passing. Throughout the nation and the world, there was a sense of deep personal loss. The greatest Air Force in the world had just lost its best friend. Since his time, much has happened, and in many ways what he stood for has come to pass. It was Hap Arnold who sought the best in aircraft and materiel, continuous experimentation, development, progress in the air. He was foremost in urging a separate Air Force for defending America in the skies. It was Arnold who urged a Strategic Air Command, our global atomic striking force, a massive deterrent to the threat of war. It was Arnold who advocated an Air Force second to none as a means not only of defense, but of preventing another global catastrophe. Hap Arnold saw the need for greater public interest in matters of air power. Without awareness and support, no nation could expect to remain strong. As the years go by, as we move faster and faster into the age of space, one influence above all seems now more lasting. It was General Arnold who envisioned an institution to train Air Force leaders capable of guiding our nation's air defense, whatever the future. The Air Force Academy, and every person who is honored to attend there, is profoundly touched by his influence. Here there is thoroughness and dedication to the task. The standards at the Academy stem in large measure from the example set by the first Air Force leader, who in June 1949 was made the first General of the Air Force. From this academy, which was once his vision, have come other leaders with the training, background, and spirit, and with their own vision of what must be done. Such leaders will help keep America free, as did one of the great generals of our time, Henry Harley Hap Arnold. General Douglas MacArthur is a figure of almost legendary proportions in modern military history. He was a great field commander, a remarkable chief of staff, and a man who made his mark on two important wars. His career had many phases. It began with leadership thrust upon him at an early age. He ended it as a historic figure in a historic speech before a joint meeting of Congress.
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point.
Indeed, much had happened to the world since Douglas MacArthur took the oath at West Point, and in the wars and the periods of peace since. He was often a central and dramatic figure. The beginning of an extraordinary career, young Douglas with his father, General Arthur MacArthur, boy colonel in the Civil War and veteran of the Philippine Campaign in the Spanish-American War. One day, when the son was 13 years old, his father is said to have remarked, "I think there is the material of a soldier in that boy," a truth that was soon made clear. Entering West Point, he showed extraordinary brilliance in his studies, attaining an average that was the highest in a quarter of a century, and he won the coveted A in athletics as well. 25 years later, he was to lead the American team in the World Olympic Games. Meanwhile, the campaign in the Philippines was being brought to a successful completion under his father's able leadership. The son was eager to visit these battlefields, and after West Point, his first assignment was to survey areas of these islands. One of these was the Patton Peninsula, where he was to fight many years later in a desperate but heroic struggle. During the following years, Lieutenant MacArthur had opportunities to study the entire Far Eastern area, gaining an insight into the attitudes and feelings of peoples hardly known by the West. At the beginning of World War I, the plan was to use only regular Army divisions to oppose the powerful German Army. Meanwhile, outside these divisions, America had many trained and able men. A proposal for a new division of National Guard units from as many states as possible was vigorously advocated by Major Douglas MacArthur. It would spread over the whole country like a rainbow. The idea for the Rainbow Division, the 42nd, was his, and he worked constantly to see that the division was well trained and equipped for the raging battle that awaited it in France. The Rainbow Division moved up to the front. Its full readiness, through the efforts of Colonel MacArthur, the division's chief of staff, was to prove fortunate indeed. It was during this period, too, that an impressive battlefield tactician began to prove himself and to foreshadow a great military future. Soon known for brilliant decisions on the battlefield, Colonel MacArthur was also to gain a reputation as a man who faced danger completely unafraid. Before long, he was in command of the Rainbow Division, the youngest American division commander in the war. Twice wounded, twice gassed, he won more awards for valor than had ever been awarded to an American soldier, and was acclaimed by the Secretary of War and General Pershing as the greatest frontline general of the war. Returning to West Point, he became the youngest superintendent in Academy history. Here, he broadened the curriculum to include a full college education and introduced a now widely followed program of intramural athletics. Under MacArthur, West Point gained an excellent academic and sports reputation to go along with its military prowess. In 1930, MacArthur was appointed Chief of Staff with the rank of full general. During his term of office, much of his time was spent in building an army that had been pared down to only 60,000 combat soldiers, a most difficult effort when an attitude of pacifism dominated the nation. In keeping with his principle of examining the military situation at close range, he toured Europe to observe the forces of other nations. In France, he was recognized once more for his outstanding military contribution to the Allied cause. In Germany, he foresaw the buildup for war. Back home, he lobbied his country and Congress to realize that the United States was in danger. As Chief of Staff, he foresaw the need for a new type of army, mechanized and mobile, and insisted that America's defense force become capable of rapid expansion. Recognizing his abilities, President Roosevelt broke precedent by reappointing the youngest Chief of Staff we have ever had to a second term. In the 20s, MacArthur had served in the Philippines, and in the 30s he was asked to return as their military advisor. A deep mutual regard between the Filipinos and MacArthur grew during this period. It was the basis for a gallant defense that was to come. In 1935, he began a 10-year plan to build up the defense of the Philippines. In World War II, it was to be these forces that MacArthur would lead in a desperate fight for survival. But now, the leader, at age 57, having served in the United States Army for 34 years, decided to retire. 4 years later, it was as though his military career were just beginning. A few months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, MacArthur had been recalled to active service in the Philippines. This was Pearl Harbor, America's prime naval base in the Hawaiian Islands. 19 proud ships rested on the bottom. 4,532 men were dead, wounded, or missing. In the hands of Japan rested the balance of power in the Pacific. MacArthur knew that America must move quickly to restore the balance. And indeed, by the morning of December 8th, Americans were aroused to the depths of their souls. They now stood shoulder to shoulder with one mind, one purpose, with the peoples of free nations everywhere. Through crowded streets, America's great war leader, President Roosevelt, drove to the Capitol.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
On the day after Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, too, were under attack. Defense here was pitifully hampered by lack of men and planes. With his knowledge of past campaigns, particularly those of his father in this very area, MacArthur withdrew his meager forces into the mountains of the Patton Peninsula. From the rocky fortress of Corregidor, he directed an operation as crucial as any in the war. This early campaign in the Philippines the heroic fighting by a lonely army of Filipinos and Americans for almost a year caused a critical delay in the Japanese timetable of attack. Back at home, the leader of the first desperate ground fighting became a symbol to a nation just beginning to gird itself for all-out war. The people found in him what they were beginning to discover in themselves, a spirit of intense determination. Suddenly, MacArthur was ordered by President Roosevelt, who held him in too high a regard to lose him, to leave to carry on the fight from Australia. Leaving the Philippines hurt him deeply. As always, he wished to be at the front, beside his comrades. When finally they were forced into the infamous Bataan Death March, his promise to them was, "I shall return." And most believed that someday he would. Until his arrival in Australia, the plan had been to await the Japanese attack and prepare as well as possible. Then, it became apparent that the new Southwest Pacific commander had another plan. He was determined to carry the war to the enemy, to New Guinea, which was the direct route back to the Philippines. At his Melbourne, Australia headquarters, General MacArthur faced grim facts. Against nearly 3,000 enemy planes, he had barely 500. Against a huge Japanese army, he had 11 poorly equipped divisions of Australians and Americans. He faced thousands of miles of Japanese-controlled islands and seas, and an area that made the vast United States seem small. American industry and labor had to quickly convert from the non-essentials of peace to the necessities of war. Conversion was slow, and the European theater had first call. There was little to spare for the Pacific, little to travel 10,000 miles from the factory to Pacific Foxhole. It was the longest supply line in the world, a supply line that was won and secured by U.S. naval victory in the Coral Sea and land victories at Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. But the Japanese were still on the move. March 2nd, 1943, a strong enemy convoy was crawling through the Bismarck Sea. General Kenny's 5th Air Force struck with every plane he could get off the ground. And they succeeded, destroying every enemy ship, leaving 22 shattered hulks. A decisive aerial victory had been gained at a critical point. The enemy had been stopped. It was time to roll them back. The job of fighting all the way back to the Philippines and beyond to Japan required the closest teamwork of sea, land, and air forces. This brought together General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz. The military leaders in Washington had a plan. 2 roads back to the Philippines, one from Hawaii along the string of coral fortresses, the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, to Palau. Another, from Australia, would cut through the jungle of New Guinea, up the stairway of islands toward the Philippines. This was the job for the Army and Navy forces under General MacArthur. First, the air arm reached ahead. Second, amphibious assault, leapfrogging to more lightly defended islands and skipping the heavily fortified ones. Up from Australia and across jungle-clad New Guinea, U.S. forces learned amphibious warfare and used the sea lanes for surprise until they had cut off Rabaul and taken the Admiralty Islands. By now, the Japanese were dug in and ready at Wewak. Instead of attacking head-on, Wewak was bypassed. Instead, Hilandia was taken in a surprise attack. The strategy was to surprise the Japanese up the stairway of islands. Against these key positions, the pattern of attack. First, heavy preparatory fire to soften up the objective. Next, the landing. These were varied, unpredictable. In each case, the selection was dictated by strategy rather than sympathetic terrain. There were many beaches. Some were ideal, hardly a matter of getting one's feet wet. Meanwhile, the gain was tremendous, the enemy never having expected us to come ashore here. Sometimes the attack was in frail craft, an easy shot for the enemy if surprise had not been accomplished. On another beach, amphibious tractors. Continually, the envelopment, the flank attack. Decisions, difficult ones, boldly made based upon unique knowledge and experience. In addition, MacArthur's use of combined operations of naval, air, and ground forces became the key to modern warfare. Leaders and men shared the glow of victory. Losses on the Allied side were relatively small, since damaging frontal assaults were avoided. But thousands of Japanese prepared to fight to the death were rarely given this opportunity. Although many were captured, thousands more were isolated, their supply and communication lines destroyed. In the words of MacArthur, who conceived and carried out the plan, the main body of the enemy was left to wither on the vine. To the outside world,